Good day, everyone. Welcome back to my shed. Neal Whitman here. And I'm going to continue my conversation, which has been thus far targeting the ideas of mental health, mindfulness, and some of the thought that has been out there over the past number of years looking for meaning in life. And the conversation today is going to focus on fear. I want to talk about fear. I think it's timely for us to look at that and to explore what exactly fear is, what it does to us, and how it affects us as a society and as individuals. My purpose here is not to try and talk about coronavirus particularly, but perhaps some of the things that this current situation has revealed to us about ourselves and about our own response to the unknown and to the dangers of life. So, I'm going to start off by giving you a quick biblical quote here. Proverbs 18:1 says, "Whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment." Now, that is a really interesting comment in light of what is currently going on. Someone might say quite reasonably that in the current situation, to fail to isolate yourself is to break out against all sound judgment. That in fact, what is required is to isolate yourself in order to prevent the death of others and potentially your own harm. And that's fine. But what's really interesting about what's going on right now is that in the midst of this coronavirus, we are responding in the way that preserves ourselves and preserves others through isolation. It is a hiding away of ourselves from risk, and it is, I would argue, and I'm not going to argue against isolation policies in any way here, but I would argue that it actually speaks to us about the theme of our response to fear. And I'd like to kind of explore that a little bit because there's more going on here than a very pragmatic and technical response to a legitimate threat. This isn't the same thing entirely as just digging a trench because it avoids the danger from enemy fire. It is unreasonable for somebody who is in a war situation not to dig a trench and protect themselves. It is unreasonable in a plague situation not to isolate and try and stymie the spread of a disease that might cause harm to yourself and even to your loved ones. But when we look beyond the technical response to try and prevent the spread of disease, we start to see some really interesting behaviors that are going on. Uh, so, for example, obviously everyone is aware of the hoarding of certain staple products. That response is an act of tremendous selfishness, right? The idea that you would go and clear store shelves in order to prepare yourself at the expense of others, even when the production chain has no sign of actually uh, being unprepared to deal with the requirements that are going to be continuing for people, right? So the toilet paper companies haven't stopped making toilet paper. You know, the food silos are still full of food. The food producers are still producing food. And I have a friend in a greenhouse here in New Brunswick, and he's still at work. He's still keeping the crops growing in the midst of the winter so that there's fresh fruit and vegetables being produced in order to be shipped out and eaten. So there's an irrational response that's going on. There's the pragmatic response, which is social distancing in order to slow the spread of a disease so that we don't overwhelm the capacity of our ICUs and our ventilators to keep people alive who otherwise might have lived. Right? That's rational, sound response. But then fear grips holds and we start to act in an irrational way to protect ourselves in the face of the unknown from things that aren't actually a threat until we as a society give in to fear and become overwhelmed by it. Now, I would like to try and steer clear of all the war analogies and such to appease the sense that, hey, Michael, if you're listening, I do want to make sure this is relatable, but we actually have to look at extreme cases to understand the more common cases of our response. The extreme cases are very educational for us in understanding ourselves and the way that we respond to threat and circumstance. So, if you were to look at the current response in many places to the coronavirus and the excesses that people are going to in order to protect themselves from illegitimate threats, you might compare that to Britain in the midst of the aerial attacks on London and the surrounding industrial cities during the Second World War. And if you if you haven't seen this, then you just don't play on the internet, because it's a meme that has been dispersed in every conceivable way. And what it is that picture of the crown and the statement under it, keep calm and carry on. And probably not everybody is aware of this, but this was part of the British propaganda during the Second War in the midst of aerial bombardments. And the idea was that the British stiff upper lip was not going to be overwhelmed with fear. People were going to accept the possibility of their own death and carry on with their lives, only worrying about those things that they can control. Children were shipped out into the rural areas in order that they might be protected from the dangers of bombs. That's actually where you get the whole Narnia series setting. If you've ever read those books by C.S. Lewis, you have the kids that they're out in a country estate, and that's because they've been moved out of the city to stay out of the bomb danger, while their family continued to work in the factories or whatever they were doing. I don't actually recall if that's even revealed in the setting of the story. But the point is that people just accepted the unknown and carried on with what they were doing. And as a society, because they had done that, they overwhelmed the German danger through sheer resolve. They could not be broken, and therefore, because they were not responding in panic and fear, they were able to produce the means of war in order that they could eventually overwhelm the German air campaign by building their own airplanes and shooting the German airplanes down. So our individual responses affect our whole society. And when people start to break, it's actually an interesting psychological observation that this thing that you're seeing is something that has been deeply understood by military tacticians throughout the ages. And this is the idea of making a unit break, right? So a unit that has a great deal of discipline and esprit de corps does not break easily. This was why the Romans were able to so often overwhelm their enemies, is because they built up that resolve and that mantra that, you know, Rome's glory was of greater virtue than their own lives, and nothing would cause them to stumble and flee. And so, holding that in their hearts and reinforcing that idea constantly meant that even when a legion was being overwhelmed and the men were dying in great numbers, the survivors continued to fight to the last man. And so they were nearly indefeatable. It's very difficult to actually destroy an enemy in truth. Uh, Army tactics typically rely on breaking the morale of your enemy, and once the first man starts to flee, it creates a cascade so that those who are actually firm in their resolve, they become abandoned on their left and right and are easily overwhelmed, right? But once the overwhelming starts to happen and people perceive that there is no hope, they start to break and flee in mass numbers and they run away. And this is even true when they ought to know, and intellectually they might know, that by fleeing they are condemning themselves to certain death because a broken unit can easily be pursued and slain by the enemy in pursuit, as they have no cohesion. And yet it still happens. So the psychology of that is fascinating. Uh, this is exactly the same thing that was taking place in the stores when you saw that people were, where I am here in the east coast of Canada, people were laughing and joking about how people in other places were losing their minds, and they were emptying the store shelves of like toilet paper, which is so dumb, and other goods that they might store for food and whatnot, and they were just carrying on as per normal. And then all of a sudden, it just happened. Like, I don't know how it started, but some people preempted, they started to panic. They went and started buying up huge amounts of these staple items. And then, when everyone became afraid that this was going to leave them without the needs that they and their families had, they quickly rushed to the store as well. Um, and before long, you saw that the stores were just completely barren of produce. And I guess, I laughed a little bit about this. To me, it's always been one of those things that you're a little bit careless if you don't have 3 to 4 weeks of supplies stored at pretty much any given time because, well, hey, we lose power for 2 weeks at a time, and um, you ought to actually have the means to provide for yourself during an emergency. But neither here nor there. I don't condemn people for trying to stock up and provide for themselves, but it's the response itself that I want to examine. The response is flee and panic overwhelms the sense, and even though you might rationally realize that what you're doing is going to ultimately cause harm to the whole society and then ultimately to yourself, you do it anyway because you don't want to be the one person left behind standing on their own. And then you start to look at the other response to this. So, again, we talk about the pragmatic response of social distancing and preventing the spread of disease, and then the irrational response of fleeing and hoarding and stockpiling. And then you have the other irrational response, even to those who may not give themselves over to that. You have the rising surge of irrational hatred that you can see all over Facebook and all over the internet, where people are responding out of fear with contempt for anyone who is not playing the game exactly the way that they are. And you see it on both sides, right? There are those who, on one side, are just filled with rage almost, it seems, in the way that they're responding to people that they perceive to be causing the spread of this disease by not conforming to isolation. And then on the other side, you see those who, um, I think typically those who have no option of self isolation because of their need to provide for themselves by working. And the reaction is often to challenge and question even that which seems to be self evident that this disease is a legitimate threat. Now, how legitimate, I won't even bother to argue. I'm not a virologist. I, I won't doubt that it's possible we find out in the long run that this thing is actually quite overblown, but it also might not be, and that's neither here nor there. The point is that people's response is to redirect their fear of the unknown into something tangible. So, I don't know what's happening. I have lost control. I don't know if I'm going to lose the people I love or potentially get sick and die myself. And I need someone to blame. But it's a plague. There's no one to blame. So I will blame those people who are not playing the game right. On the one hand, I will blame those people who aren't conforming perfectly to all of the restrictions. And who cares about economy? Who cares about whether or not you are poor and can't feed your family? It's not worth you killing people to be going out and going to your workplace. And on the other hand, people who are saying, how dare you be holding up the production of things like chloroquine or other, supposed treatments for this when this obviously could make the whole thing go away. It's you panic ridden people who are completely succumbing to government lockdown that are actually condemning all of us to permanent poverty. And we rush into condemnation of others rather than simply confront that there is something which is bigger than us that we can't control. And that isn't to say that we just take a fatalistic attitude and do nothing. And I'm not actually personally in disagreement with investigating chloroquine or any other random drug that might possibly be of value. And I'm not against isolation for a period of time that prevents tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from dying. That's not the point. The point is that hating people for a disease is not actually legitimate. Your response is a redirection of your fear because you can't control it and you're seeking to put it somewhere. You're really ultimately trying to deal with that thing that all of us need to deal with, and that is that we aren't as in control of things as we think we are. Now, I would actually observe that this present fear is simply a supplement for example, the global warming fear. Um, Again, I'm not here saying global warming isn't a thing. It seems to be a thing. Climate change seems to be a thing. Um, I can't argue the science of it. I do offer for those who might be on one side or the other of this debate that the answer should be a lot more study and research and efforts to try and understand what's happening and make right decisions to prepare ourselves for the consequence of it, because the climate is an enormously complex system that we haven't completely understood. And so, if it's a legitimate danger to us, let's come up with legitimate answers and not panic. But again, global warming, yeah, it seems to be a thing that's happening, right? And its consequences are not those things that we can truly, completely understand. But everybody gets filled with a hatred over it. I mean, you can't listen to Greta Thunberg and not see the anger that is the response in the heart of a young person, and it is echoed by millions of others. And the anger is that you are breaking my world. You are taking away my control of the world, and you are the problem, and I will hate you for it. And that is a wrong response. It is not a helpful response. In fact, you're missing the point when you do that, that certainly making advocacy for things that would ultimately understand and deal with a problem that might cause considerable harm to us is a worthwhile thing. But hatred is of no value. It simply isolates and forces opposition. When you act in that way, you actually harden those who are opposed to your current position into their opposition of you. You can't collaborate and work together and come to productive changes in that way. And you know this, right? Like, this is obvious truth. When you go on the attack because you're filled with a self-righteousness that anyone in opposition to you is a demon, an enemy, an agent of Satan who is seeking to destroy your life. Well, no, they aren't, man. Like, that's simply not true. And you have to know that on some level. It's certainly true that they are selfish people. You are also a selfish person. Like, you have to know that about yourself. They aren't a worse person than you just because they hold a different opinion on something that is important. They are simply a person who has come to different conclusions. And if you want them to change their mind, the right response is to go and to seek rational dialogue and informed dialogue to try and seek out truth together. But instead, fear of the unknown drives you into hatred, which just builds opposition and creates irresolution that can only be resolved ultimately by violence or oppression. So we respond to fear of the unknown by trying to regain control of things that we actually never controlled in the first place. You know, you actually see, I mean, I almost laugh, although it's sad, that you see all these folks posting things about the coronavirus, saying things like, oh, nobody listened when Mother Nature was in danger, so Mother Nature says, have a coronavirus. That'll sort you out. That'll lower emissions and fix things by breaking the economy. Like, yeah, okay. I see you take the Thanos answer to the world's problems, but you're kind of missing the point that plagues will not ultimately fix the damage that we're doing to the environment. Better technologies might, if we're actually intelligent about the way we progress and seek to minimize our impact on the environment. But like, you could kill half the world's population, and in 50 years we'll just be there again, right? So like, it could be less. You know, when you have a major die off, it's quite frequent that people react by responding to death by creating life, and you might even see a major baby boom like we did after the Second World War, and then 20 years later, you've just got the same world population you used to. So again, there's like this irrational hatred that is our response to fear. And why do we do that? We do it because it makes us feel like we're in control if we have something to attack. But you can't attack the unknown. It's all rooted in the false sense and desire for control. Now, I want to give you a very real life response to why I am not unprepared for the unknown of coronavirus and why I and my family are not overwhelmed with this fear of the unknown. It's not because I'm a better person than anyone here. It's not because of some mystical understanding that I have. It's because of a gift God gave to my family, a gift of tremendous uh, reality. So it would have been almost 15 years ago that my oldest son was born. And when he was born, he had a condition that is called transposition of the great vessels, and you can look that up. He also had a hole in his heart. What that meant was that the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary artery and the aorta had grown into the wrong side of his heart. And as a result of this thing that happened, um, he could not live. He was destined to die without medical intervention. And so he had to go into surgery, and that happened in the first week of his life. They didn't know about it before he was born. It wasn't revealed until after he had come out and started to basically suffocate. Because if you don't understand what that does, it means no oxygenated blood can go to the body. So they performed the surgery, having kept him alive by giving him a hormone that keeps a duct between the two sides of the heart open um, during in utero life, and so that was able to keep him at like 60 to 65% O2 sats, which a grown-up can't survive, but an infant can, until they could perform the operation. And there was a 70% chance that he was going to die during that operation. And you know what? I had no control over that. There was no power in me to determine the outcome of what was going to take place when he went on the operating table. He would die or he would live, and that's all there is to it. And he did live, and he has actually grown up as a healthy young man who is actually uncommonly strong for one with that condition. We were able to repair the hole in his heart at the same time by putting a mesh screen in. But he also has developed a major aortic aneurysm because the pulmonary artery, which is stretched over to do the service of the aorta, it's not as strong, and so the pressure is a lot higher than it's built to take. And it was also required to stretch to get there. And so what happened is that it ballooned out. And now, as my son is going through puberty, the doctors have made it quite clear it's very possible that he could grow and this could strengthen and he might live a full life. And it's also very possible that he will die in the next 5 years from, this not growing the way that it needs to for him to be healthy and strong. And it's also true that because an aneurysm of a major vessel is quite weak, that it could be ruptured if he's in a car crash or in a major impact of some kind. So that's just been life for us. We have had to accept that this is a thing we can't control. And I'll even tell you an interesting story that I think it was probably the year after. I think Wolf might have been 10 at the time. The year after they had found the scope of the aneurysm and told us that this was going to be a major factor in his long term health. That I remember it was around Christmas time, and I heard Wolf cry out, and I went into the kitchen, and he was on his knees clutching at his chest, and he said, "Ah, my chest hurts. My chest hurts." And I thought, oh no. And I grabbed him and threw him in the car, drove to the hospital, which at that time was like 2 minutes away, went into the ER, chest pain. They got him immediately in, obviously. And, about 5 minutes later, the doctor came in after looking at his chart, and he said, okay, so there's something I want you to understand, and I'm just going to be straight with you. So I get why you're concerned, but this aneurysm that your son has, if it goes, he won't be in pain. He's just going to fall over dead. It will be so fast that if the aorta ruptures, he'll be dead in 30 seconds and he'll just immediately go into shock and fall over. Um, you don't have to worry your head about whether or not he's bleeding out from a chest pain like this. And, as it turned out, he just basically had a major case of heartburn and indigestion and, a couple of Zantac, and he was good to go. But, so you just live with that reality that my son is possibly just going to fall over dead someday. And he knows that. I mean, this is not news to him, and he lives his life carefree and happy and has accepted that he is a mortal. A mortal. He is also one who has strong faith and trusts that he is immortal. And so it truly doesn't bother him, probably as much as it bothers me. He's just come to terms with it. I think it bothers him more that he can't be a soldier like his old man, although I think he's come to terms with that too. So, mortality, like, this is the thing that extreme circumstance teaches us. And if you aren't willing to humble yourself, to go back to where we started in this conversation, and listen to the lessons that life is teaching you, then you are condemned to always be suffering in irrational response to the fear of the unknown because you don't know what's coming. You are not actually in control of all of your outcomes. We talked about that before, but it is fundamental to understanding what you need to do in order to live a productive and sane life in the midst of the uncertainty of humanity and its existence. You can't control who will hurt you. You can't control what will come to pass to hurt you. I I think we are deeply hampered in the West by false sense of security because we have so many great medical advances that we think we're in control of stuff. And so I actually saw a meme from one of my former colleagues, and it was he had posted this on his Facebook. It was a picture from an atheist website, and it had this group of clergy, you know, an imam and a rabbi and a Catholic priest and a pastor and a Buddhist monk, and they're all clustering, wailing around this scientist who's looking into a microscope. And the sense of it was that, yeah, you all act like you have faith, but when the real thing hits, that's when people turn to science. Like, yeah, okay, well, that's extraordinarily ignorant and dumb because you have falsely thought in saying this that religious people don't practice science. You, if you were to actually take the time to look at the history of medical advances, would find that the vast majority of our great medical advances have been found by people of faith who believed in a God and also believed in scientific progress. So that's dumb. But also, it's actually not true that people of right faith and Christian biblical faith respond in this way to crisis. Certainly, do we look to science to help us if it can? Absolutely. But there's a fundamental principle in responding to the fear of the unknown that we have to understand if we are going to live as free people in this world, and that is that God is in control and you aren't. So you might look at James chapter 4, and I'll give you the reference if you want to look this up. It's James chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. But and that's, by the way, James is it's actually the first letter of the New Testament chronologically. It was written probably before any of the Gospels even. Um, and it basically gives some very practical guidelines for being a Christian and being a true Christian and what that looks like. Um, you know, spoiler alert, it doesn't look like being a ceremonial, uh, ritualistic, high Catholic type person. It's very practical and pragmatic. But here in James chapter 4 and verses 13 and 17, what James says is, do not presume in yourself to say that I will go here or there and conduct business and make money, but rather say, if the Lord wills it, I will go here and do this or go there and do that, because you don't know if you will be alive tomorrow. This is a fundamental principle for dealing with anxiety and dealing with the unknown of the world. You need to accept that you are not in control of everything that happens to you. You are in control of what you do, and that is all. So accept that you don't know if you're going to be alive next month. Accept that the coronavirus might come in and kill you. Even if you're not, you think, in the vulnerable population, you don't know if you might have cancer and actually be vulnerable. You don't know if you might not be on that bed gasping out for air while you suffocate under the phlegm of the coronavirus. It's a horrible thought, but it's true. You also don't know if you might get the coronavirus and not even know that you had it because your symptoms were not even there. You were asymptomatic and you were a carrier, and that you might kill people that you care about because you went into their presence and they get it from you. You're not in control of that, ultimately. You can only choose not to take risks that are unnecessary, and you can choose to not live in fear of it, but carry on with life trying to be productive and helpful to others. There's a really, I think, important observation I've seen a number of times here, which is, guess what, guys? Church isn't canceled. The services may not be attended, and we may be doing them online, and we may be at home, but guess what the church is? It's all the people who serve others and love God. And that's what James says. Read the book of James, guys. Read it. If you have any interest at all in understanding Christianity, read the book of James and look at its pragmatism. It is a simple idea that Christianity, true religion, is this: helping widows and orphans in their distress, guarding your tongue, seeking heavenly wisdom, and not avoiding the consequences of living in a broken world, not sitting in avoidance. And that's where we get back to this whole thing. So it might not sit soundly with you to say, in this present circumstance, whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire, he breaks out against all sound judgment. But it is truth, because if you want to live in this world with all of its unknowns, with all of its certainties, which are you are going to suffer and die, you are. If you live in this world, you are going to suffer and you are going to die. Fact. Whether it's from the coronavirus or whether it's 40 years from now, you are going to suffer and die. And even if your death is quick, you'll suffer between now and then with pains and ailments and betrayals and hardships. This is life. Deal with it. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to sit there in fear and isolate yourself like a madman? Is that what you're going to do? Are you going to be like that guy who built the great big plane there and had all the money in the world? Name escapes me, but you know who I'm talking about. He ended his days as a paranoiac, having all of the pleasures of life at his fingertips. He basically hid himself from all people because of his tremendous fear of the things that he couldn't control. He wanted so desperately to control things, and yet he couldn't. So, in the end, he isolated himself, and he basically became of no value to himself or to anybody else. This is the real consequence of isolation. Even though you self-isolate, which is to say you avoid physically contaminating other people, this is not a time to isolate. It's not a time to insulate and hide from the world. It's a time to reach out and to build relationships. It's a time to educate yourself. It's a time to become more valuable to other people when the isolation is over. Don't sit there on the couch moping and hiding in fear, but live your life as somebody who, if they live, has something to offer others, and while they live, continues to offer something to others. What is the bloody point of just choosing to die prematurely? And that comes down to it here. This is where the rubber meets the road, guys. So I talk about mental health a lot. I have seen a lot of soldiers who have been broken by their circumstance, and I've seen a lot of civilians who have been broken by the hardships that they have faced, some self-imposed and some imposed on them by the vicious cruelty of others. And their response to that is to introvert and hide and even to drug themselves into a state of insensibility rather than confront the world around them with all of its myriad problems and try and actually be someone of value and virtue. You can sit in your basement and smoke pot 10 grams a day on your veteran's pension in Canada, and you are already dead. You have committed suicide while you were alive. You continue to breathe, but you have chosen death instead of life. Will you not pursue something of virtue rather than just simply succumb to the enemy, which is the certainty of death and that unknown hurt that is going to hit you if you should choose to do something? This is it. Now, why is it that a Christian need not succumb to the spirit of fear? If you look at Luke 19, Jesus answers his disciples and he tells them what is coming. And he says There will be wars, there will be plagues, pestilences, and famines, and these things must come. So we're not spared coronaviruses, we're not spared famines and starvation, and we're not spared wars. He also says that if you follow him, that the government will call you into court, they will persecute you, and some of you will be put to death. That has certainly been true of Christians throughout the ages. The Romans did it in huge numbers, and then the Catholic Church did it to Christians who actually spoke out against abuses of the decadence of Catholic religion. And they are still being put to death. It's still illegal in Afghanistan to be a Christian. It's still illegal in most Islamic countries to be a Christian. In Nigeria, Christians are being put to death in huge numbers right now. Not that anyone cares. It's it's uh, it's irrelevant to the world. In South Sudan, Christians were being put to death for their faith by Muslims for decades. It's a huge problem, and nobody intervened, right? This is the way that Jesus told us it would happen. It was a certainty that this would happen. And are we being put to death here? No. Although our government recently tabled legislation here in Canada which makes it illegal to actually talk to somebody who is a homosexual or a transgender person that wants to change that and to counsel them in any way. Um, so that's conversion therapy. Yes, it's often been a very abusive thing and a very harmful thing. I'll talk about that perhaps in another video, but I'll tell you what, if a transgender person walks into my office and says, I am hurting from this, and surprise, guys, people with transgender inclinations and sense of self, they usually suffer depression and anxiety. That's not me just saying that. That's like verifiable. Look at any psychological evaluation of gender dysphoria and its consequences, and its whether it's consequences or perhaps related to these other things. People with that sense of self are often deeply hurting from it and deeply confused by it. And my response to that person would not be to condemn them, and it would not be to even doubt the reality of their experience, but I would certainly try and help them to respond to those feelings and that sense of self by seeking God and seeking to live a life that He would be pleased with in spite of that tragedy of their confusion. And if the government puts me in jail for that, so be it. I don't care, honestly. Because I have known this was part of the deal. This is part of the deal of being a Christian, is Jesus has said plagues, wars, pestilences, persecution by the government. It also says that your brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers will hate you. The world will hate you. Yeah, and I have known that to often be true in my own experience, and certainly it is clearly true in the experience of Christians all around the world that you are ostracized and despised if you act like somebody who has truly put their faith in God. I don't even care to dissect that or explain it in this particular video, but these are the costs. This is what's going to happen. And accepting the certainty of coming suffering is very possible when you look at the end of what Jesus says there, which is that, and you shall receive eternal life. I have hope. I know the presence of Christ in my present life. I know the presence of peace from my interactions with God. I know the very real blessing of God's presence in my life. And the hardships of the world I would face one way or the other. The hardships of the rejection of the world because I've chosen Christ, I can deal with because my relationship with God is a greater relationship than I would have had with any of those people anyway. And I have perfect hope. Death is not the end. I don't look forward to suffering. I don't look forward to dying in pain, but I probably will. And that's okay because there's something beyond it. I have faced a lot of trials in my life. I've faced I have faced deprivation on a level that most people never will until they start to come to the end of themselves. Self imposed, I suppose. I mean, military training is really what I'm talking about there, and sometimes the deployment and the life of that, it can be very physically hard and very mentally and emotionally trying. And I know what that is, and I could do it because I felt the goal was worthy. I do not live in fear of my son dying. I know that he's going to die. It's a certainty. I hope that it's, you know, after a life of having really enjoyed life and found purpose and meaning in his life. But if it's tomorrow, then I will not be shocked by that. I have no promise from God that this won't happen. I only have the expectation that this world in its brokenness will produce suffering. And so I can accept those things because my hope in Christ is so much greater than them. This is really the answer to all of the mental health dilemmas that you face. It is not that they will be taken away, but that something far greater in purpose, hope, and meaning will overlay them and they will seem diminished in comparison to what that is. It will provide for you a goal that is worth striving for and is also true. And so that's my offer to you. In the present struggle, as people panic, would you like to be free of panic? Would you like to actually have your eyes shut again so that you're not as aware of the fragility of our society, the weakness of what we've built, and its susceptibility to mob destruction through selfishness of the masses? Are you wanting to close your eyes to the reality that you are actually not in control of your life and death? Too bad, right? Because that is not the answer. Even if you can accomplish it, it will only be through self deception and, you know, to to borrow the Vervaekeism, if any of you are watching Vervaeke, it's not that you can actually truly lie to yourself. You can only BS yourself into believing that it's not important and trying to hide it from your thinking. But it's still there and it's still festering away. Those are realities. You have to face them. So will you face them alone, or will you face them standing as a servant of God who created all things and knowing that you can prevail because He is on your side? You'll never have strength over death yourself. It is going to get you. You'll never have strength over suffering yourself. It's coming, and it's probably already in your life. But if you serve God, then you have everything that you need. And so that is my offering to you. Fear is a real thing. It has power if we do not turn to that which is more powerful. So please, if you have questions, challenges, arguments, or comments, by all means, throw them in the comments section. And if you want to sometime do a live stream kind of interactive conversation about these and other events, we can probably arrange that too. I'm all ears and here to serve. So cheers, world, and God bless.